Thank you for being a part of our very special track on supply chain. We're all set to bring to you our industry leaders panel discussion, and I'm sure we can hope for some amazing questions. Let's use this interactive platform. Let's make these conversations very interesting as we get set for our panel discussion on creating the unbreakable supply chain, where our panelists will discuss a lot about how driving efficiencies in the supply chain can result in large environmental efficiency gains, how executives can overcome the common legacy system issues that impact the modern supply chain, how can one really retain the confidence of customers during a crisis. All this and more, all thanks to our expert panelists. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Mr. Rajiv Ganju, Senior Vice President, Global Supply Chain, Luminous Power. May I also extend a warm welcome to Mr. Mahesh Khetan, Global Head Supply Chain, Advanced Material Chemicals Division, Aditya Birla Group. May I also present to you Mr. Samrat Sehgal, Head Supply Chain, Dabur, India. A very warm welcome to Mr. Vivek, Sarbhai, Senior Director Supply Chain and EHS, India and Middle East, Thermofisher Scientific, and a warm welcome to our moderator, Mr. P.S. Easwaran, Partner, Deloitte, our knowledge partners. Thank you so very much for being a part of this very interesting panel discussion. Over to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Isha, and thanks for the introductions. I think it's fantastic that we have a panel which covers every significant segment of our industry, and I'm really hopeful that we'll have some very exciting discussions as we move forward. I think just on what you said, the unbreakable supply chain. If you had asked CEOs of companies about 2-3 years back and where supply chain was sitting on the agenda, obviously it will be important, but it would not have been a boardroom agenda. Today, I can tell you very confidently that literally in every boardroom, the most talked about word is supply chain. And it can be in various forms. It can be about supply chain resilience. It can be about supply chain risk. It can be about digitalizing the supply chain, or it can be really about supply chain competitiveness. The fact is that all dimensions of supply chain have become extremely relevant over the last couple of years, and no questions as to why it is like that. Couple of things that I would want to sort of talk about, and maybe have our panelists to discuss this as we go by. One of the most important things that is getting very much into the mainstream is really around how much do we understand our supply chain. I think one of the big areas that leaders are grappling with in companies is, and what I would call philosophically, the end-to-end visibility. It's an oft-used word, but really least understood. And therefore, I think we'll spend some time in each of the conversations to really understand as to how these leaders are attempting to create that end-to-end visibility in their value chain. And the moment you have visibility, then you have the ability to have flow of information, you have the ability to have flow of material, and therefore have the right insights to make the right decisions. So that's one that I would really talk about. The second one, which I would also want to discuss, is really the whole dimension around supply chain resilience. I think today with the panelists that we have here, we're really talking about companies which are highly successful, and obviously a representation of the market which is going to be even more successful going forward. And therefore, the second dimension on resilience that I want to touch upon is not just around really the resilience of today, but also how are we really preparing ourselves for the future? And will we have supply chains which can take care of our growth in the future? So that's possibly the second one that I would like to have some dimensions and discussions upon. And because there are also factors around reforms that are happening on one side, factors around global trade plays like the container crisis which is happening, and obviously a lot of free trade agreements which are also external influencers of global value chain participation. So I would want to talk about that. And I think the third one, as we speak about both the resilience on one side as well as an end-to-end visibility, I want to sort of have them to get a little bit deeper into the next level and say, what are we thinking about from the dimension of really creating digitization and digitalization initiatives, or at least thinking about them as we move forward. Where are we seeing the big benefits? How are we really able to look at futuristic cases which are beyond the ordinary today? And therefore, what is creating competitive advantage for them? So I would sort of like to talk about these three. We have a fantastic representation. We have someone who's completely aligned to pharmaceuticals like Vivek, or rather in a big way. I would say, Mahesh, you have a big global value chain participation being a chemical company. I think Samrat, you have proliferated, I would say, every store in the Indian market, and therefore, someone who really understands India pretty well. And Rajiv, you've saved many lives, right? Your inverters in the COVID crisis, with all the ambulances have saved many lives. So all of you have huge perspectives from the marketplace, and I would ask each of you to touch upon these two or three dimensions as you speak. So in no particular order, but what I thought as a theme for this, and the way I look at it, we'll spend about 5 minutes with each of our panelists to have them articulate their thoughts about how they really went through the evolution of their supply chain with all the disruptions in the near term, and how are they preparing for the future. So maybe that's possibly the first thing that I would do. Maybe I'll start with maybe Rajiv. I'll start with you, and since we are sort of short of time, given all the schedules that we have back to back, we have 5 minutes for each of us, and after that we'll get into a Q&A. I have some questions, and maybe we'll have some questions from the audience too. So Rajiv, maybe you're on the left of my screen, so I'll start with you. Rajiv, you represent Luminous Group, and the big portfolio that we all know is inverters. So maybe from your viewpoint, some quick introductions, and maybe the dimensions that I spoke about.
Thank you, Ishwar. Thank you for giving me a chance. And what a great topic you have started. Very rightly said that supply chain is today the key discussion which happens in boardrooms. Not only because it has to become resilient. It has in COVID times. It has to be different. It has to be sustainable, flexible, tailored. So these are the key things which are being talked about today's world in supply chain. I represent Luminous. Luminous is in three businesses. We call power electronics and power storage, home electrical business, and we are also into solar business. So we are number one market share in inverter in India, but we also export to 32 countries. So we had lot of supply chain disruptions which we had to tackle, because inverter were also coming into the emergency categories where we had to support, like rightly you said, hospitals, COVID care centers for uninterrupted power. So we had to tackle about that. So taking you a little back to March 20, when we started getting news about the epidemic or the pandemic is happening, like what as a organizations we did first was that we take good care, like we understand like our people are safe, our premises are safe. So a lot of focus shifted. All of us understood what is the importance of safety in supply chain. So we all of us used to talk about EHS, and now this was the new normal that we had to maintain social distance. So when you have to maintain social distance on production lines, which means that you have less manpower on each line, but productivity has to remain same, because ultimately you have to churn out maybe faster goods, because you are into that emergency category, not only in India, but you have to export it to other countries because they also need your uninterrupted power during those times. So what we did is that we started analyzing, and value stream mapping took a new turn. Non-value added activities had to be taken out. Lot of digitalization had to happen, so that you can even see that digitizing washrooms that earlier we were used to, like we had to have touch free, so that we can prevent like as much as touch is possible. It started from there, went to shop floors. You had to digitalize how through digital means even the maintenance of the machine can be done, how you can do lot of RPS, robotic process automations, so that you don't have physical inspections, you don't have to visit the shop floors. You had to use SCADAs so that you analyze data and you can forecast better how the lines will behave, how each section will behave. And then you had to not only take care of your shop floor, but the complete value chain which is sitting outside your factory, that is your vendor system. So during these resilient times, we had to have good connect through digital means with our vendors, so that, like rightly you said, whether we capture the right demand, because demand shifted, demand was different. So earlier, if you were into low kVA inverters selling more, now the need became more. high kVA, suddenly demand shifted from low kVA to high kVA. You had to keep continuously your vendors informed about what kind of systems we have. So our vendors were given assurance that these are the forecasts, we will do like this, how we will lift material, how we will make safety as a norm. And then we had to use the methods in supply chain to exactly grasp the demand. You had to go to the last mile, that is your consumer, then to dealer, then to distributor, keep him engaged, keep him like even a dealer who earlier used to sell that customer walking in his shop. Now we did a new method that we created these digital groups inside within the dealer, so that dealer can communicate with customers digitally and customer can put his demand digitally so that he gets served better. Lot of channel with e-commerce, which used to be a certain percentage of our sales, suddenly geared up, became double, triple, four times. And we had to gear that how to service these e-commerce channels so that we reach our consumers through that. So a lot of innovation happened in the supply chain. It became more flexible, it became more resilient, and we were had to be more accurate in calculating the demand, not only the demand in various districts of India, but even at the village level, we had to see what kind of demand is there and how we can serve our customer better.
Thanks, Rajiv. I think fantastic. And I think, very quick summary, but I think really talked about two, three things which I picked up, and maybe we'll have a detailed discussion in the chat. I think you spoke about how the alternate channels really came up, the e-commerce. That's one. Second is the demand was proliferated all over India. And more important, you said the global demand also came in. And to that extent, I think a lot of non-personalized stuff at the shop floor levels, a lot of automation, a lot of safety related work, and assume that you're continuing all that as you move forward for competitive advantage. So I assume that you're doing that. So thanks Rajiv for those words. Vivek, since Rajiv spoke about hospitals and he spoke about ambulances and therefore the need for uninterrupted power, you are in very similar I would say needs from the consumer perspective, right? You served the pharma industry in a significant manner, or the value chain of pharma, a lot of reliability and integrity of supply chain which was required. And therefore, I think going forward, I think there is a lot of, I would say, infrastructure creation as well as infrastructure maintenance which are associated with reliability and integrity of supply chain. So any views as to how you looked at this market and what did you really do as differentiators from a supply chain perspective?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Ishwar, for asking this question. So, from my side, the key learnings have been that it all depends on how do you respond to a certain situation. So, the responsiveness element came into play, and responsiveness, or in technical terms in supply chain, we normally call it agility. We actually ended up redefining the agility word in our organization. And if you don't mind, I can just share one slide if that is possible.
You can, Vivek. You can. I think you'll have the opportunity to share a screen if you want. Yeah.
If you can see this. And we have this 5-pillar approach where if I have to take you the 3 pillars, which are customer at heart, plan to win, and speed at scale. These are all the pillars where we see action on the ground. And the other 2 pillars, the digitalization and the talent powerhouse, is the enablers to these 3 pillars. And the kind of outcomes we are looking at, and I've not tried to define the outcomes in terms of top line growth or bottom line growth or cash flow growth. it's basically trying to redefine the whole ecosystem the way we look at it. So it's like, what is a best-in-class customer engagement score? So we have a very different way of measuring customer service, which is Net Promoter Score driven. It essentially tells us whether our customers will promote us internally in their organization and externally to the outside world. We are looking at reduction in cycle time by at least 50%. So what is need to be done, which will help us reduce end-to-end lead times by at least 50%. It could be manufacturing localization, it could be network expansion, it could be automation, it could be digitalization, it could be anything. And then what are we also looking at is how do we increase our intellectual capacity at low cost by 50%. So the biggest waste in any organization is the intellectual waste. Every organization hires the best people, tries to hire the best people, but do they get the real work out of them? I think it's the biggest challenge. So we are looking at how do we use this digital capability which we want to build and actually result in at least a 50% increase in intellectual capacity at no extra cost. And finally, the cost. How do we make cost as an enabler to a competitive advantage? So these are the outcomes we are looking at. The wisdom is very clearly available from the topmost people we know. And I've just put two quotes from Elon Musk and Sundar Pichai. If you don't do digitalization, there will be only two companies, one with the business, one will not be with the business. And I think it's one of the most profound implications, artificial intelligence, which is what Sundar Pichai says. It could have more profound implications for humanity than electricity or power. So we have recognized that. And just to give you a very quick view of what we did as an organization, we actually did three things very differently than what we used to do in the past. A, we collaborated with all the government agencies, which you can think of. And we collaborated with logistic companies, right from DHL or FedEx to Blue Dart. That brought us together because if you have to manage COVID, and we were the largest supplier of RT-PCR kits anywhere in the world, if you had to do this fast at a scale, that's what we call speed at scale, we needed government support, government agency support, and we also need logistic companies to prioritize and work through us. Just to give you one example, what we did in 2020 back at the peak of the crisis, we actually changed the schedule of Blue Dart flight and made it land in Pune, where there was no landing, they didn't have Pune as their city that time. And just to give some samples or some work to be done with ICMR. So to that extent, we went and did that. And that's a story which, is a great story, which itself takes a lot of time to explain. But in one word, I can tell you it's an end-to-end collaboration, which we never attempted in the past. So that was one reason why we ended up doing what we did. The second thing which we did in a short span of time, and Thermofisher is a large organization. It's a $35 billion company, and India is roughly around $500 million business. And Middle East is another 500 million. So it's like $1 billion between the two markets. And we were having this RT-PCR kits which were coming from America and all those places. So we actually ended up localizing it now. So the RT-PCR kits which we supply today in Indian market is locally manufactured in Bangalore. And a record time of, I think, 4 months, we put that kind of facility. These are some examples of the speed at scale which we work. Then we have put, the amount of detail level planning which I have seen in my career in the last 30 years in supply chain, which we ended up doing, and I'm sure every panelist will probably say the same thing, was of a totally different magnitude. So the challenge was how the day will happen, how the week will happen, how the month will happen, how the quarter will happen, but also how the year will pan out. And I think that multi-dimensional planning challenge, at least I experienced it for the first time. So these are some of the stuff which we did and some of the areas where we're trying to go forward in our attempt to create the agile supply.
I think very interesting. I think Vivek, what you said, two things very interesting. One is really that 50% increase in intellectual capacity, right? And essentially, I think the two examples that you mentioned, be it around the end-to-end collaboration, government on one side, logistics service providers, and maybe I would assume that the hospital and the caregiving community would be on the other side. So that is on one side. And I think to that extent, I think the end-to-end collaboration would never have been possible unless you are able to enhance your intellectual capacity, because you just have only so many hours left in a day. I think the second one I think found very interesting is, I'm sure you would have used a fair bit of analytics and insights, because you also spoke about digitalization and you have AI written on a couple of those references. I think your entire day-to-day planning would also have a fair degree of, I would say, technology support for you to make it happen on an ongoing basis. So I think those are two, I think, very interesting things. And the third, quite naturally, I think fits within our Make in India program, is really your ability to localize it at the shortest possible time. So I think some very interesting dimensions that you're looking at. And I think the big takeaway for me is really to look at that intellectual capacity augmentation, which you spoke about. It's just not about human resource productivity, but goes beyond that. So thank you, Vivek. I know, Samrat, maybe I'll come to you next with for a change to consumer business. I know you've been on the plane running in and coming to a place to take the call. So thank you for joining. And Samrat, no stranger to the market in India from a consumer perspective, and therefore the expectations of customer experience would obviously be very high for someone like Dabur. And to that extent, I think a disruption or no disruption, there are expectations of the brand. And second is, obviously you've also expanded your portfolio as we speak. So to that extent, how did really supply chain take these two dimensions into account? One is really fulfilling customer expectation with all the disruptions in the market. And the second is really enabling the growth of the portfolio. So how did these two happen? Any quick views and also some thoughts on the organizations?
Yeah, thank you, Ishwar. Good afternoon, everyone, all the panelists. I think it's a pleasure connecting in this call. Ishwar, to get to an answer to your question, I was just reflecting on what happened post-pandemic. Once the lockdowns were announced, I was just reflecting on the first discussion which we had. First you can say Teams call which happened. I think there were three key priorities which I remember from the notes which we had made on that particular day. Three priorities which I remember were basically, first was, of course, first thing which we discussed was on the employee safety. Then the second topic we discussed was the cash management. How much cash is there in the market? Are we able to do the collections? How is that happening? Is it impacted? Because retail was impacted. All the shops were closed. Distributors were not able to distribute the goods. They were also not able to collect cash from the market. So we were also a bit concerned. So that was probably the second topic which was discussed. And then the third topic, which various people try to articulate in different ways, and all non-supply chain people, they were trying to articulate. So the third topic which everyone was trying to discuss was, what is our ability to connect with our customers, with our suppliers, and overall the ecosystem partners? Essentially, one single word which will define all these three things will be actually the supply chain. So people post that, actually, there was a tremendous shift in the way the supply chain function was being perceived within the organization. Of course, the importance of the function is always there. Historically, over the last 8-10 years, we can say supply chain as a function has been becoming the center point, or the focus function for any organization. But post pandemic, things have changed drastically. So various people, when they were having discussion on this topic, they were articulating in different ways, but ultimately they were all referring to the supply chain. So I think one key point which has come out during this pandemic period is that earlier people used to say these are the brands which are competing with each other, or people used to say organizations that they are competing with each other. But actually post pandemic, everyone realized that it is the supply chains which were competing with each other. Any supply chain which was more agile, which was more you can say evolved, they were able to help the organization to grow. And that is precisely what we have seen in the last 5 to 6 quarters. I think within Dabur, we have seen that the way supply chain was able to evolve itself, it helped the organization to probably deliver incremental growth backed by the supply chain performance. Now, what are the key things which we actually did? We of course, we were, if I take basic examples, first thing which we tried to address was how do we get orders from the customers. There was a time when, you can say 5-6 years back, customers were placing orders over a phone. Then of course, replenishment systems evolved, and orders started coming through particular tools, which will be all, inventory will be managed at the distributor end. So all those models started developing. But post pandemic, it was a big issue that how do you actually receive the order, because you were kind of cut off from the customers, you were not able to reach them. So this was one big issue. Collection of cash or collection of receivables. This was another issue which was, a big thing which was impacted during the pandemic. Then the third was, of course, connecting with the customers in terms of connecting with your modern trade customers, with your retailers, with your distributors. All these things were, basically impacted. And what was the need of the hour? Need of the hour was that all your decision making should be data driven only. You could not have taken any call on any supply related topic without having proper data and information available with you. This was the biggest challenge which we were facing at that point of time. Not only the internal data, the need was to have the external data, which was probably not so much organized. So unorganized data had to be actually collected, and you had to make it in an organized way, and you had to actually create an as much as possible an end-to-end visibility for yourself. Now, the good part was, at the similar time, there were a lot of startups which were evolving. So I will say 3 or 4 good things which happened at that point of time. Some of the startups which were, coming up, they were actually able to, do small pilots for us at a very, very low cost. And we were able to actually experiment with 3 or 4 models for actually creating a digital structure, which would help us in this, data driven decision making. So we did some of those pilots. Some of them we have been able to scale up. And another good thing which has happened is that earlier any IT intervention or digital intervention required an ROI to be given for the organization. But now it's a matter of survival. CEOs are no more asking what is the ROI here. So you are able to do it at a low cost anyways because of the startups which are there. And second, no ROI is being asked because it is a matter of survival. So, some of these experiments which we have been able to do and scale up, they are helping us in actually, making the overall supply chain better to make the product available.
Thanks, Samrat. I think very interesting ones. I think what you said, I think everybody is listening to that, supply chain leaders should go and ask CEOs for budgets. That I agree with you. This is the time to go and ask for budgets. But outside that, I think on a serious note, I think the way in which you have innovated for digitalization is what is the takeaway. You really looked at, proof of value rather than the classic proof of concept, etc. You really looked at proof of value, did that in a quick time. You scaled it up across your businesses, and therefore you had a real need being satisfied by some of those ecosystem partners. I think that's an interesting one. The second thing that I picked up on what you said, very interesting, is in spite of all these disruptions which were happening, and many of us obviously know the issues, but I think the reaction was based on insights and data which were coming out, out of the organization. Therefore, I think a lot of both structured and unstructured data. I hear you mentioning external data also, which I assume would be all the COVID-related factors and information, etc. But I think very interesting is that you use both structured and unstructured data. I think some good perspectives from you on that. So with that, Mahesh, I know that I come to you last, but I think very important dimension, because I think we have spoken about a lot around what we have done with India in context, what we have done with the garments, and therefore the entire value chain, etc. One of your biggest exposures as a chemical organization is also the global movement of both pricing, goods, as well as therefore trade flows. So how did you, good, interesting one to hear your perspectives on what did you do to, one, obviously the short-term requirements, but really how are you really building up the the capabilities for the future to be future ready. So quick words from you on that, Mahesh.
Thanks, Easwaran. Very nice to hear Vivek, Rajiv, and Samrat. And a lot of a mix of all the things what they have mentioned, we have also done, though it's a little bit of a global business. So, I mean, we are into a business of specialty chemicals, wherein, we have 3 manufacturing facilities in India, Thailand, and Germany. Most of our raw materials are imported, and most of our finished goods are exported. So it's a very complex business in this kind of a pandemic scenario, in this kind of disruption, where we have to depend on international logistics and global supply chain to a very great extent. But I mean, though it all started in the month of March or April last year, started with the demand shock, where the demand went down drastically, and then immediately followed by 6 months of time with the supply shock, where the demand went up to the roof and the supply was not available. But this kind of disruption actually is not very new to the supply chain professionals. We are seeing it at least for last 3-4 years, every year. I mean, if you start with 2018 environmental restrictions, which were imposed in China, and hundreds of factories in China shut down. And that created a kind of a supply shock globally. And then 2019, due to US-China trade war, again, there were supply shocks plus demand shocks, and the global network modeling went for a toss. And 2020 came the pandemic. But the kind of disruption the pandemic brought into the supply chain was not brought earlier by the earlier disruptions. And now again, we are seeing a new disruption in China, where the government of China announced energy consumption policy, and again, hundreds of factories are shutting down in China. So, and this will have an impact in the remaining part of 2021 and a major part of 2022. So the new disruption is already happening as we speak. So supply chain professionals have to manage, handle, face the disruptions all the time. But what the disruption caused by pandemic has done is it has exposed the defenselessness of the supply chain into many organizations. So whether our supply chain or the business processes had been flexible enough to absorb the disruptions and take the required steps immediately, that became very important. So what we, in terms of the chemicals global supply chain, the network modeling became very important as the disruption began in April last year. So when I say network modeling, it does not mean necessarily very sophisticated, using spending crores of rupees on external consultants to do network modeling and using very sophisticated software. It is just to decide from where to buy your raw material, where do you produce, and where you store and where you're selling. So everything, the entire structure changed, because there are many countries who were net exporters became net importers because of the pandemic, because their manufacturing facilities shut down and their domestic capacities reduced, and vice versa. So we had to naturally look into if we are buying something from China, suddenly if China is unable to supply, can we buy from Europe, and vice versa. So this changed significantly. That naturally changed the storage locations globally, the size of the warehouses, distribution centers, and the location of the warehouses. And of course, where do we produce? So if India is under lockdown, but Thailand is working, we have to produce in Thailand and service our customers from Thailand. Now, similarly, when India, Thailand were running, Germany went into lockdown. So these kind of things kept on happening very frequently, and almost every 1 or 2 months, we had to change our complete network modeling. So the network modeling exercise itself, which used to be like, once in a 2-year, 3-year kind of an exercise, the frequency of that changed. So we had to do it again and again. And as Samrat also mentioned, the cash flow management or the working capital management became very important. Suddenly, everyone felt when the pandemic began last year that they're sitting on loads of inventory, and huge working capital is blocked. So, and their vendors and their customers were also in the similar situation. And the request to increase the credit period started in the entire value chain, right from vendors to the manufacturers to the customers everywhere. Now, this resulted into a lot of new financial instruments like discounting the LC, particularly from the countries which were offering very low interest rates. So we had to get our LCs discounted from the banks in the countries which were offering annual interest rate of less than 1%. And that's how we could support our vendors as well as our customers. So lots of evolution happened in the financial instruments in terms of working capital management itself. And then, as Rajiv mentioned, they had to do a lot of alignment with their dealers and distributors. We had to relook at our partnerships with our third-party service providers. So whether it's a logistics service providers, shipping line, or our warehouse service providers, the relationship changed completely because the need was to have tremendous flexibility into the supply chain, and you cannot have flexibility if you are owning the assets everywhere in the world. So you have to depend on the services of the third party, and many new businesses emerged out of these, as all three of the panelists mentioned earlier. Many new business opportunities emerged, many startups came into the play. And as Samrat mentioned, it was ROI was no longer a priority. It was must to have rather than good to have. So many things became must to have without the look of ROI. So short term, we did network realignment and the working capital management and partnering with our third party service providers. In the long term, of course, finally, we have decided to invest a lot of capex this year. So with this, with the organizations like ours and similar organizations did historically best EBITDA, historically best profit in last 1 year during the pandemic, and that prompted the management to invest in expansion and in backward integration. So USA, which was the very difficult market to service because of the logistics challenges, we have decided to put up a greenfield project in USA now. We are doubling our capacity in India and entering into backward integration projects. So that is on the long term, I would say.
Perfect. Thanks, Mahesh. I think interesting dimensions like what you said, an exercise which was done on network modeling for every 2 years is now like a monthly affair that you're doing. So therefore, I think some of those practices change, and to that extent, the strategy and the operating model, like what you said, the dimension towards backward integration, a lot of reforms from the government also enabling that. So I'm sure you're taking advantage of that. And the interesting thing about discounting is also pretty interesting because that's where the end-to-end integration of supply chain finance with supply chain material and information flow happens. So thank you so much. And I think we have 5 minutes. So what I'll do is I'll just take one question from each one of you. I don't know, Stan, whether we have any questions from the audience. I'm not able to see that. But what I will do is I will quickly have one questions for each one of you. Maybe Mahesh, since I left with you, I'll quickly check with you. See, today you spoke about a lot of imports and significant exports, and everybody in the world knows that there is substantial container crisis happening in every part of the world, and therefore absence of ships too in many cases. How are you dealing with some of these disruptions? Are you able to see it ahead of time in some manner, or are you looking at it after it hits you? Where do supply chain resilience and sensing come up?
So, Ishwar, what happened is when the pandemic began, the shipping lines reduced their capacity by withdrawing the large vessels and reducing and not producing new containers, stop investing into the capex. And then the demand went up from, say, September, October last year, and the container shortage came into the thing. And the entire global supply chain got disrupted. So what we did is wherever the containers are available, for example, initially the containers were available in India. So we used to manufacture in India and service the customers from India. Then the container shortage started being felt in India, but it was available in Thailand and Germany. So we shifted our manufacturing, most of the products to other manufacturing locations. So it was like wherever it is available, you use it and move the goods from there.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mahesh. And Samrat, you spoke about unstructured data in your question, and somewhere I think you are now in the mode of one, obviously expanding in the marketplace with multiple portfolios and multiple segments, and at the same time, like what you said, sensing of demand becomes very, very significant. So, any views on what lessons for companies to use unstructured data in about 30 seconds?
I think, Ishwar, the biggest lesson which we have is, again, I go back to the history of supply chain. Some of the key things which, which we were doing earlier, and maximum amount of time which we were spending on was how to manage the inventory, right? What is the expectation of the customer is something which is now very clear to the supply chain people now, So, for example, any customer, he can transfer today. We are talking about digitalization and digitization. So, customer can transfer money at the speed of light. And the expectation of the customer is also same, that you should be able to, supply the material at the, the product at the speed of light. That is the expectation. So we have to now, of course, inventory management and, some of the other peripherals of supply chain, we have to keep doing. But, customer has to become the center spot for each and every decision which, which a supply chain professional is taking.
Perfect.
What does the customer essentially need today? The customer today needs, you can say, a tailor-made delivery experience for himself. Whatever kind of customer he is, whether he's going and buying at the retail outlet, whether he's sitting at his home, or whether he's going to a modern trade store. So, they really want a tailor-made delivery experience. Our focus also has to shift to that. They, of course, want agility and a quick turnaround. That's, of course, customer, as I am saying, that their expectation is speed of light. So, more than that, they also want reliability and trustworthiness of your product and your delivery model. So some of these things have become the center point for all supply chains today. That's the way we are also working. So essentially, some of the basics which we are doing is, of course, to have a differential supply chain for each and every model model as in, each and every
segmented supply chain is what you're trying to do.
Absolutely. Segmented supply chain, which actually means differential SKUs for each customer, each channel, different SKUs for each channel. So that is one differential supply chain principle which we are following. Of course, inventory norms, we have to manage it in a different way for each and every channel, because demand fluctuation, predictability of the demand for each channel, there is a different behavior which is there. Packaging, of course, has to be different for each and every channel. E-commerce probably has a requirement which is different than a retail outlet. So differential packaging we have developed for each and every channel. Delivery methods also, so we are experimenting with differential delivery methods. So, one is the original model of, distributor and then wholesaler and, retailer. That was one of the delivery models. Now companies are experimenting with a delivery model where you are trying to go direct to retail. So from your own warehouses, you are going directly to the retail. Of course, one of the model is the e-commerce, but companies are evolving and developing their own e-commerce platforms as well. So these are some of the things which supply chain has to also evolve to, and make sure that, while you maintain your agility, but you keep customer as the center point for each and every decision which you are taking.
Perfect. Thanks, Samrat. I think fantastic what you said. Vivek, maybe 30 seconds from you. I know we are on the clock, but between you and Rajiv, one question is, Vivek, I think you spoke really about localization, and you spoke about accelerated localization. What's your take to participants on really accelerating the Make in India and the localization? Any two lessons that you had which made it successful for short-term localization, because everybody is looking at it?
So I think we should be very clear from any organization perspective that what is the strategic reason why we would like to localize. And I think the opportunity which India has in a multinational setup is that can a multinational company have a footprint which will ignore India in future? So if that answer is yes, then the second question is, when do you do that? And I think with COVID happening and India becoming the center spot in terms of vaccine manufacturing, etc., I think our organization at least sensed it that it's the right time to enter India in a bigger way than what we had thought.
Thanks, Vivek. And Rajiv, one last question before we wrap up for the day. Rajiv, one interesting thing for you would have been spike in demand, which would have accelerated, and after that, today possibly a stability in demand. How are you really managing what you built up earlier for now? Is it that there is sustaining growth which can take care of all this, or have you built up variabilization and capacities which are able to take care of this? Rajiv, you're on mute.
Thanks, Kishore. I know we have paucity of time, so wanted to deliberate a lot on this. But today is like we saw, like agility in supply chain. We need flexibility in supply chain. Like Lou likely said that all panelists touched that we had a peak at one time. At that time in supply chain, you had a lot of constraints, vendors, everybody, how to meet that. Then you have stable. Then you may even have a trough, but you have to make your supply chains through digital means. You have to make them smart. What is a smart factory? Smart factory like smart city or a smartphone, or we have smart devices, is connected. You are connected to local market. You get the information rightly on time of every demand, and based on that demand, the entire your vendor value system, everything is aligned. And through all these digital means, always your smart factory is to the tune understanding what the consumer wants. And today you have those flexible systems wherein you can ramp up fast, ramp down fast. So every supply chain has to be prepared. So while agility is key, I think all supply chains have to be flexible and they have to be tailored, because the consumer is changing his mind. You have to understand consumer, and you have to understand before he changes his mind, so that you can have that customized products for him, customized SKU for customer. I think in all these supply chains, I think customer is playing a very important part, and we have to tune into that. Have flexible, tailored, and you have to have those supply chains which are much more agile.
Perfect. Thanks, Rajiv. I think that sort of sums up what I think our panelists are to offer. Great learning for everyone. Fantastic, insights coming in from each one of you. And I'm sure it's all very practical and implementable, which was the outcome of this discussion. And therefore, first of all, Samrat, Vivek, Mahesh, and Rajiv, once again, many thanks to the four of you for making it extremely lively and very, very productive. And thank you, Isha, for the time from everyone. So I think we're going to wrap up the session, and we're sort of 5 minutes out. But I think thank you so much.
Thank you, Ishwar, for
Thank you so
nicely
very much.
moderating.
Thank you.
Ishwar.
Thank you all the panelists.
Thank you.
Thank
all.
you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Easwaran, for moderating the session so very well. And you very rightly mentioned that the takeaways from all our panelists here are very, very easy to implement. And I'm sure that our delegates had a lot to learn from the way that you, along with your organizations, have been working on making sure that your supply chains are smoother. So for all stakeholders involved, thank you once again for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you all here.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
And at this point, I'd once again like to mention to all those attending the summit, this very, very special track on supply chain will continue to bring some absolutely fantastic speakers through the day. So please do continue with your presence here, be a part of our various sessions. Coming up next will be transforming supply chain to raise performance now and next. But before I introduce to you our panelists, I'd like to encourage you to visit us at our experience zone, get to know more about all that we've put together for you. May I also request all of you to please fill and submit the feedback form. That's really how we come up with these digital platforms being so interactive. So we'd love to know from you what you think about us and the speakers and the sessions that we've lined up for you. May I also encourage you to visit our partners in the partner booths, connect with them, download their brochures. And a lot of excitement around that is because the more interactive you are, the more chances you've got to win yourself some amazing gift vouchers worth 5,000 rupees from ETH. So don't miss on that chance. And let's have the excitement going. I also encourage you to please share your thoughts on the social media, and do remember to tag us using our hashtag ETGDI Summit. And coming up next will be our panel discussion. So please do stay tuned. We'll be back in a bit.